The silence, in a five-star restaurant, isn't actually silent. It's a low, rhythmic hum of polished silver hitting fine china, the muffled laughter of people who have never looked at a price tag in their lives, and the subtle, rhythmic popping of vintage champagne corks. But when my son, Jason, stood up and threw that crumpled piece of paper into the trash can next to our table, the world went dead quiet. It was the kind of silence that feels like an ice pick to the chest. "Dad, stop wasting my money on this garbage," he hissed. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a jagged, serrated edge that cut right through the ambient noise of the Emerald Room. He didn't just throw the paper away. He discarded it, with the same casual disgust you'd use for a used napkin. Then, he leaned over the table, his face just inches from mine. I could smell the expensive Cabernet on his breath, the wine I had taught him how to breathe, how to swirl, and how to appreciate 20 years ago. "From tomorrow, your allowance is cut to 0, he said, his finger trembling with a strange, manic rage. "You stay in your room, you do not leave the house. And you most certainly do not embarrass me in front of my associates again. Do you understand?" I looked at him, and for a split second, I didn't see the CEO of King Logistics. I didn't see the man who graced the cover of Business Insider last month. I saw a small, cruel boy who had forgotten where his shoes came from. Then I glanced at Valerie, his wife. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look embarrassed. She was smirking behind her crystal wine glass, her eyes dancing with the kind of cold triumph you only see in people who think they've finally won a war they didn't even have to fight. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. If I had opened my mouth, the 40 years of Shark King, instincts I'd spent a decade suppressing would have come roaring out, and I wasn't ready to end him just yet. I simply stood up, adjusted the sleeves of my worn, decade-old suit jacket, and walked away. But what Jason didn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom in his ivory tower of arrogance, was that the money he claimed I was wasting was never his. It was mine. Every cent, every truck, every shipping lane from Boston to Berlin, it was all mine. The next morning, when he woke up to buy that custom-ordered Porsche he'd been bragging about all night, he was going to find his world had turned into a ghost town. His bank accounts empty, his credit cards frozen, his CEO title revoked like a library card for a delinquent borrower. I am Conrad King, and this is the story of how I taught my ungrateful son the hardest lesson a man can learn. You never, ever bite the hand that built the table you're sitting at. To understand how we got to that table at the Emerald, you have to understand the basement. For the last 5 years, I've lived in the servants' quarters of my own estate. It was Valerie's idea, of course. She called it practical. She said the stairs in the main house were getting treacherous for a man of my vintage. She spoke to me with that saccharine, condescending tone people use for toddlers or the dying. Jason had just nodded, looking at his watch, his mind already on a board meeting. So, I moved. I took my books, my old radio, and a single framed photo of my late wife, Catherine, and I went down into the damp, quiet bowels of the mansion I had built with my own 2 hands. I stayed there, playing the role of the senile, retired father, while they threw galas above my head. I listened to the thumping of bass and the clinking of glasses through the ceiling pipes, a ghost in my own kingdom. I accepted it because I thought I was being a good father. I thought Jason needed the space to grow, to lead, to become the man I hoped he could be. I thought that by making myself small, I was making him big. I was wrong. I wasn't making him big. I was making him a monster. The night of the dinner was supposed to be about Sammy, my grandson. He was turning 10. Sammy was the only thing left in that house that still felt like home. He'd sneak down to the basement on Tuesday nights with a box of crackers, and we'd talk about the stars or how the shipping docks used to smell before they became luxury condos. He was the only one who didn't look at my old shoes with disdain. "Grandpa," he'd whispered earlier that day, tugging on my sleeve, "are you coming to my party?" "Wouldn't miss it for the world, kiddo," I told him. I'd spent weeks preparing his gift. It wasn't a PlayStation or a designer watch. It was a Numui treasury bond. I'd bought it the day he was born, 10 years ago. It was a tradition my own father, a man who worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, had started for me. It wasn't about the $50. It was about patience. It was about watching something small grow into something significant over time. It was a lesson in value over price. The Emerald Room was packed with the new elite, men in Italian silk who measured their worth by the weight of their watches, and women who looked like they'd been sculpted out of ice and Botox. Jason sat at the head of the table, holding court like a king who had inherited a throne he didn't deserve. When it came time for gifts, Valerie's parents handed Sammy a set of keys to a junior dirt bike that probably cost more than a teacher's annual salary. Jason gave him a custom-made gold chain. The table cheered. The excess was nauseating. Then, it was my turn. I reached into my inner pocket, my hand trembling just a little, not from age, but from the weight of the moment. I pulled out the beige envelope. "Happy birthday, Sammy," I said softly, handing it to him. "This is for your future. It's about learning to wait for the things that matter." Sammy reached for it with a genuine smile, but before his fingers could even brush the paper, Jason's hand shot out. He snatched the envelope like it was a piece of contraband. He ripped it open, looked at the bond, and then let out a sharp, cruel bark of laughter that silenced the entire table. $50, Jason announced, holding the paper up for the hedge fund managers and socialites to see. $50. The table erupted into polite, stifled snickers. "Dad, we're at the Emerald," Jason said, his eyes cold and mocking. "The tip for the valet is more than $50. This isn't a gift. It's an insult. It's you being a cheap old man who still thinks it's motngin chin chambay mui." "It matures, Jason," I said, my voice steady despite the heat rising in my neck. It's a lesson in how to be a loser," Jason interrupted. He crumpled the bond in his fist and tossed it toward the trash can. It missed, hitting the floor near a waiter's foot. "Stop wasting my money on this garbage." Valerie leaned over to the woman next to her, her voice loud enough for the whole table to hear. "You have to forgive him. He's getting forgetful. We let him live with us out of charity, but he just doesn't understand how the modern world works. He's a drain on our resources, honestly." The pity in their eyes was worse than the anger. They looked at me like a stray dog that had wandered into a wedding. I stood up. The chair scraped against the marble floor, a harsh, grounding sound. "Where are you going?" Jason snapped. "We haven't even had the cake yet. Don't make a scene." "I'm going home," I said quietly. "Fine, suit yourself." Jason waved a hand dismissively. "Just don't expect the driver to take you. He's busy. Take the bus. It's cheaper. Just your style." I walked out of that restaurant with my back straight. I walked past the mater, who looked at my scuffed shoes with a sneer. I walked out into the cool Boston night, but I didn't go to the bus stop. I walked to the furthest corner of the parking lot where my old Ford sedan was hidden away. I'd just unlocked the door when I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy, aggressive footsteps. It was Jason. For a split second, a foolish, flickering part of my heart thought he was coming to apologize. Maybe the mui kung bottle of wine had worn off. Maybe my son was still in there somewhere. "Give me the keys," he demanded, holding out his hand. "What?" I asked, confused. "The keys to the car, Dad. Give them to me. Now." "Jason, I bought this car 15 years ago. This is my property." "And who pays for the gas?" Jason stepped into my space, using his height to try and intimidate me. "Who pays for the insurance? Who pays for the repairs?" "I do. Everything you have is because of me. You live in my house. You eat my food. And tonight, you embarrassed me. You made me look like the son of a pauper in front of my investors." He lunged forward and snatched the keys right out of my hand. "You're grounded," he said, and he wasn't joking. "From tomorrow, you don't leave the estate. That bonchum monthly allowance I give you, canceled. You don't need money. You have everything you need in that basement. If you're going to act like a child, I'll treat you like one." I looked at the man standing before me in his nam kong suit. I remembered the day he was born. I remembered the day I handed him the keys to the company, telling him to take care of the legacy. "You're making a mistake, Jason," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "The only mistake I made was not putting you in a nursing home sooner," he spat. "Now walk. It's 5 miles. Maybe the cold will clear your head." He turned and walked back toward the warm, golden glow of the restaurant, twirling my car keys on his finger. I stood there in the dark. The wind was biting, and my knees ached. But I didn't feel the cold. I felt a strange, terrifying sense of clarity. For 5 years, I had been the patient father. For 5 years, I had let them humiliate me because I thought it was the price of a quiet retirement. But as I started the long walk home, I realized the price was too high. I reached the mansion just after midnight. I didn't go to the front door. I went to the side entrance, down the stairs, and into my damp little room. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't need to. I sat on the edge of my single bed and reached under the insole of my left shoe. I peeled back the tape and pulled out a small, black micro SD card. Jason thought he owned the company. He thought he owned the house. He thought he owned me. But he had never actually read the fine print of the King Family Trust. He was the beneficiary, yes, but I was the grantor. And in the world of high-stakes logistics and billion-dollar trusts, the grantor is God. I opened an old, dusty laptop hidden in a hollowed-out book on my shelf, a machine Jason thought was a paperweight, but was actually a satellite-linked terminal. I inserted the card. The screen glowed blue, illuminating the wrinkles on my face. I dialed a number I hadn't called in half a decade. It rang once. Yes, a gravelly voice answered. It was Sullivan, my old legal shark. He was 80 now, but I knew he was awake. Sullivan never slept when there was blood in the water. "It's Conrad," I said. There was a long pause. I could hear the flick of a lighter on the other end. "Is it time?" Sullivan asked. "Execute the doomsday clause," I said, staring at the picture of Catherine. "I want it all gone, Sullivan. By sunrise, I want them to realize they aren't kings, they're just tenants." "And the boy?" Sullivan asked. "Sammy stays with me," I said. "But Jason and Valerie? I want them to feel every inch of the pavement I just walked." "Consider it done," Sullivan whispered. I hung up. I looked at the Dumui bond I had retrieved from the restaurant floor on my way out. I smoothed it out and placed it on my pillow. I took a pen and a scrap of paper and wrote 5 words. It was never your money. I walked out of the basement, out of the gates, and into the waiting darkness. The game hadn't just started. It was already over. But as I stepped into the black car Sullivan had sent for me, a thought struck me. Jason wouldn't just fold. He was my son, after all. He had my temper. He was going to fight back. He was going to do something desperate. I didn't know it yet, but the Yanamui bond was about to become the least of his problems. The leather of the Cadillac's back seat felt like an insult. It was too soft, too cold, and far too reminiscent of the life I'd walked away from 5 years ago. As the city lights of Boston blurred into long neon streaks against the rain-slicked window, I sat in the silence, listening to the hum of the tires. Sullivan was sitting up front next to the driver, his silhouette as rigid as a tombstone. We were heading to a safe house, a penthouse I'd bought under a shell company back when Jason was still struggling to pass his SATs. He didn't know it existed. He didn't know half of what I owned existed. "You're quiet, Conrad," Sullivan said, not turning around. "I'm just thinking about the boiling frog," I replied. "It's an old cliché, but it's the only thing that fits. If you drop a frog into boiling water, it jumps out. But if you put it in cold water and turn up the heat slowly, it stays until it's cooked. I was that frog. For 5 years, Jason and Valerie had been turning up the heat, 1 degree at a time, and I had just sat there, convinced that the warmth was love. It started the day we buried Catherine. My wife was the spine of the King family. I was the muscle and the brain, but she was the soul. When the cancer took her, it took my compass. I remember standing at the cemetery, the wind whipping through my hair, feeling like the shipping empire I'd built was just a pile of cold, heavy stones. Jason had stood there, his arm around my shoulder, sobbing. He looked so vulnerable, so ready to step up. "I'll take care of everything, Dad," he'd whispered over her casket. "You just rest. You've earned it." I believed him. God help me. I believed him. 3 months later, I sat him down in my mahogany row office. I signed the papers that made him CEO. I remember the look on his face, not of gratitude, but of a starving man finally getting a seat at the banquet. I told him the only condition: keep the name clean, Jason. Take care of the people who built this with me, and take care of me. I'm tired. He'd hugged me. He'd promised. But then Valerie arrived. She didn't come into our lives like a storm. She came like a fog, subtle, pervasive. At first, she was the perfect daughter-in-law. She brought me tea. She asked about the old days on the docks, and she listened to my stories with wide, attentive eyes. But slowly, the narrative started to shift. It began with the dinners. I'd be sitting at the table, and Valerie would gently suggest that maybe the business talk was too stressful for my heart. Then it was the house. She'd mention how the upstairs was drafty, and how the stairs were punishing on my knees. The real shift happened 18 months in. I'd come upstairs to get a glass of water at 2 in the morning, and I overheard them in the kitchen. He's a liability, Jason. Valerie's voice was sharp, stripped of its honey. He wanders around the house like he still owns the place. He talks to the staff like they're his friends. It's embarrassing when we have guests over. They see this old relic, and they wonder if the company is as outdated as he is. He's my father, Val, Jason had said, though his voice lacked conviction. He's a ghost, Jason, and ghosts belong in the shadows. The basement suite is beautiful. It's private. He can have his books, his memories. He won't have to perform for anyone anymore. It's a mercy, really. A mercy, that's what they called it. I should have fought then. I should have fired him, evicted her, and reclaimed my throne. But I was grieving, and I was lonely, and a part of me wondered if she was right. Was I a relic? Was I holding them back? So, I went. I moved into the servants' quarters. I watched as they redecorated the mansion, stripping away everything Catherine had loved and replacing it with cold marble and chrome that looked like a high-end surgical suite. I became the basement ghost. I did the chores they didn't want to pay a maid for. I ground the coffee beans. I watched Sammy when they wanted to go to the Hamptons, and I watched the money. That was their biggest mistake. They thought that because I was in the basement, I wasn't looking at the ledgers. About a year ago, I started noticing the leaks. 100,000 here for a charity gala that never happened. $500,000 there for consulting fees to a company that shared an address with Valerie's sister. Jason wasn't just running the company, he was gutting it. He was treating 40 years of my sweat and blood like a personal ATM. But tonight, at the Emerald, when he threw that bond away, that was the moment the water reached a rolling boil. "We're here, sir," the driver said, pulling into the underground garage of a sleek, anonymous building. Sullivan and I stepped out. We took a private elevator to the top floor. The penthouse was pristine, exactly as I'd left it years ago. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out over the skyline. Somewhere out there, in the sprawling mansion in Brookline, Jason and Valerie were probably clinking glasses, laughing about the old man they'd finally put in his place. "Sullivan," I said, my voice sounding foreign in the luxury of the room. "Is the trigger set?" Sullivan opened his briefcase and pulled out a tablet. "The command was sent 10 minutes ago. Since it's Sunday night, the banks are closed for physical business, but the digital sweep is instantaneous. The King Family Trust has officially revoked Jason's status as a beneficiary. As of Muri High, Mode AM, his personal accounts are flagged for internal fraud review. His corporate black card, dead. His access to the company's servers, terminated. And the house? Technically, the house is owned by an LLC, which is owned by the trust," Sullivan said with a grim smile. "I've already alerted the utility companies. Since the account holder, that's you, has requested a service suspension for renovations, the power and water will be cut at Sao, com AM sharp." I checked my watch. Mot, 4:15 AM. "He's going to wake up in the dark," I muttered. "He's going to wake up in a tomb, Conrad," Sullivan corrected. I sat down at the desk and opened the tablet. I had access to the mansion's security cameras, a system I'd installed myself and never told them about. I pulled up the feed for the master bedroom. The room was bathed in the soft, blue glow of high-end nightlights. Jason was sprawled out on the king-sized bed, his silk robe discarded on the floor. Valerie was fast asleep, a silk mask over her eyes. They looked so peaceful, so entitled. They had no idea that the very floor they were sleeping on was no longer theirs to stand on. I swiped the screen to the basement feed. My room. It looked pathetic. A single bed, a rickety desk, and the damp stain on the wall that I'd asked Jason to fix 3 times. Seeing it from this angle, through the lens of a camera, I felt a wave of nausea. How had I let them do that to me? How had I let my own flesh and blood treat me like an unwanted piece of furniture? But then I saw it. The door to the basement opened. It was Sammy. He was in his pajamas, holding his teddy bear. He walked over to my empty bed and sat on the edge. He looked around the room, his small face pinched with worry. He reached out and touched the Namui bond I'd left on the pillow. He didn't throw it away. He didn't laugh. He picked it up, hugged it to his chest, and started to cry. My heart shattered into a million jagged pieces. "Sammy," I whispered, my hand trembling against the screen. "What is it?" Sullivan asked, walking over. "He's looking for me," I said, my voice thick. "They're going to wake up and realize I'm gone, and they're going to take it out on him. They'll tell him I abandoned him. They'll use him as a pawn." "You knew this would be messy, Conrad," Sullivan said softly. "Revenge isn't a surgical strike. It's a scorched earth campaign." I don't care about the money anymore, Sullivan, I said, standing up. I want the boy. If Jason wants to play the role of the big bad CEO, let him, but he's not keeping my grandson in that house. We have the legal paperwork for an emergency custody hearing based on the living conditions and the financial instability we're about to create. Sullivan reminded me, but that takes time. Days, maybe weeks. I don't have weeks, I snapped. I looked back at the screen. Sammy had fallen asleep on my narrow, uncomfortable bed, clutching that wrinkled piece of paper like it was the only solid thing left in his world. Suddenly, the bedroom feed on the tablet flickered. Jason was sitting up. He was rubbing his face, looking at his phone. I watched his expression change. It started with confusion. He tapped the screen repeatedly. Then, he sat bolt upright, his eyes wide. He was checking his bank balance. I watched him scramble out of bed, nearly tripping over the rug. He ran to the window, looking out at the driveway. He was probably looking for my car, realizing I wasn't there to be his punching bag. He grabbed his robe and started shouting for Valerie. "Val, wake up! Something's wrong with the accounts." The ghost morning had begun earlier than expected. I watched as Jason ran to the hallway, his face twisted in a mask of panic. He didn't go to Sammy's room. He didn't check on his son. He ran straight for the stairs, heading for the basement. He was coming for me. He wanted answers. He wanted his allowance back. He burst into the basement room, kicking the door open so hard it hit the wall. Sammy jumped, waking up with a scream. "Where is he?" Jason roared, grabbing Sammy by the shoulders. "Where's your grandfather, Sammy? What did he do to the accounts?" Sammy was sobbing, shaking his head, clutching the bond. Jason saw the paper in the boy's hand. He snatched it away, his eyes turning into slits of pure, unadulterated venom. "Is this a game?" Jason hissed, looming over the terrified 10-year-old. "Did he tell you to do something? Tell me where he is, or so help me, you're going to wish you were in that basement with him." I gripped the edge of the desk in the penthouse so hard the wood groaned. "Sullivan," I said, my voice vibrating with a rage I hadn't felt in 40 years. "Call the security team I have on standby near the estate. Tell them to move in. Conrad, if we move now, we lose the element of surprise for the legal case. The police will see it as a domestic dispute." "I don't give a damn about the legal case," I screamed, turning to him. "He's laying hands on the boy. He's broken. He's desperate. And a desperate Jason is a dangerous one." I looked back at the screen. Jason was holding the paper, Nummuy bond, in front of Sammy's face, ready to rip it to shreds. But then, he stopped. He squinted at the paper. Something was written on the back of the bond. Something I hadn't noticed when I smoothed it out. Jason flipped the paper over, and I saw his face go from red to a deathly, chalky white. He dropped the bond as if it had turned into a poisonous snake. He backed away from Sammy, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No," Jason whispered. "No, no, no." "What's on that paper, Sullivan?" I asked, leaning into the screen. I didn't know it yet, but my late wife Catherine had left one final secret behind, a secret that was about to turn this financial execution into a bloodbath. I watched the screen, my heart hammering a rhythm against my ribs that felt far too young for a 70-year-old man. On the monitor, the grainy infrared feed showed Jason standing paralyzed in the center of that damp basement room. The Nummuy bond lay on the floor between him and Sammy, like a fallen leaf from a poisoned tree. "Sullivan, zoom in on that paper," I commanded, my voice barely a whisper. "What did she write?" Sullivan's fingers flew across the tablet. The image sharpened, the pixels smoothing out until the back of the bond was legible. My breath hitched. It wasn't a bank code. It wasn't a legal disclaimer. It was Catherine's elegant, flowing script, the handwriting I used to see on grocery lists and love notes for 40 years. "Jason, I saw the ledger in the study. I know about the missing funds from the retirement pool. I died knowing your heart was already empty. If you are reading this, it means you have finally pushed your father too far. You are not a king because of your name. You are a king because of his mercy. And mercy, my son, is a finite resource. Do not look for more when the well runs dry." I sank back into the plush leather of the penthouse chair. My chest felt tight. Catherine had known. Even then, in the final months of her life, while she was wasting away and I was busy trying to buy her more time, she had seen the rot in our son. She had seen him skimming from the employee's pension fund 10 years ago, and she hadn't told me. She'd protected me from the truth, even then. On the screen, Jason's reaction was visceral. He didn't look remorseful. He looked terrified, then humiliated, then worst of all, indignant. He kicked the bond across the room. "Lies," he screamed, his voice distorting the tiny speakers of the monitor. She was sick. She didn't know what she was talking about. Sammy was curled into a ball on my old bed, sobbing quietly. Jason didn't even look at him. He turned and stormed out of the basement, leaving the boy in the dark. "It's Namwitam, Conrad," Sullivan said, checking his watch. 2 minutes until the hammer falls. I watched the clock on the wall. The seconds ticked by with the weight of a funeral march. I thought back to the early warning signs I'd ignored. I remembered the time Jason was 24, and he'd crashed his first Ferrari. He hadn't asked if the person he'd hit was okay. He'd asked if I could make the police report disappear. I'd done it. I'd called in a favor. I thought I was protecting him. Now, I realized I was just watering the weeds. Sao, Hong Am. On the security feed, the mansion suddenly plunged into absolute darkness. The soft blue nightlights in the hallway flickered once and died. The hum of the industrial HVAC system, the heartbeat of the house, sighed into silence. I switched the view to the master suite. Valerie was sitting up in bed, her silk sleep mask pushed up onto her forehead. She looked around the pitch-black room, her mouth open in a silent O of confusion. She reached for the bedside lamp. Click, click, nothing. She reached for her phone. I saw the glow of her screen illuminate her face. It was the blue-white light of a digital ghost. She was frantically scrolling. I knew what she was seeing. Every app on that phone was linked to a corporate account that no longer recognized her biometrics. A moment later, Jason burst into the room. Even in the dark, his panic was palpable. "Val, the power's out. The water's gone." "Jason, my phone. I can't get into the banking app. It says, access revoked." Her voice was rising into a frantic, high-pitched register. "What did you do? Did you miss a payment?" "I didn't miss anything," Jason roared. "It's him, the old man. He did something. He's gone, Val. He's not in the basement. He's vanished." "Vanished?" Valerie scrambled out of bed, her expensive silk gown catching on the corner of the nightstand. "How could he vanish? He can't even drive himself to the grocery store." "Both." I watched them scramble through the dark house like rats in a maze. They were using their phone flashlights to find their way, the beams cutting through the gloom of the million-dollar mansion that had just become a cold, hollow shell. "They'll head for the office next," Sullivan predicted. "Jason thinks he can just walk into King Logistics and override the system. He still believes the staff is loyal to him." "Let them go," I said. "I want them to see the doors close. I want them to feel the weight of the glass when it doesn't slide open for them." But as I watched them, a new subplot was brewing on the monitors. I saw a car pull up to the gate of the estate. It wasn't the police. It wasn't my security team. It was a black Mercedes-Benz S-Class I recognized instantly. "Is that Marcus?" I asked, leaning forward. Sullivan squinted at the screen. "Marcus Thorne, your former COO, the man Jason fired 3 months ago to make room for Valerie's brother. Marcus had been my right hand for 30 years. He was the one who knew where all the bodies were buried and where all the gold was hidden. Jason had discarded him like a piece of trash, calling him too old school for the new direction of the company." I watched Marcus step out of the car. He didn't look like a man seeking revenge. He looked like a man coming to collect a debt. He walked up to the gate and pressed the intercom. Of course, the intercom was dead. He waited for a moment, then pulled out his own phone. Suddenly, my private line buzzed. "Conrad." Marcus's voice was deep and steady. "I saw the movement on the offshore accounts. I knew you'd finally woken up. Marcus, you're at the house." "I am, and I'm not alone. I've got half the board of directors on a conference call. They're tired of the losses, Conrad. They're tired of Jason using the company as his personal playground. They want to know if the king is back, or if they should start liquidating the assets before the bankruptcy attorneys get involved." I looked at the screen. Jason was standing at the front door of the mansion now, screaming at the silent gate, his phone flashlight waving erratically. He saw Marcus's car. He started frantically banging on the glass of the door, thinking Marcus was there to save him. "The king isn't back, Marcus," I said, my voice cold. "The king is burning the castle down. Tell the board to meet Sullivan at the office in 2 hours. By then, Jason will be at the gates, and I want them to watch when the security guards escort him off the property." "And after that?" Marcus asked. "After that, We rebuild. But first, we purge. I hung up. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my stomach. This was the boy I'd taught to ride a bike. This was the man I'd cheered for at his MBA graduation. And here I was, coordinating his public execution with the surgical precision of a hostile takeover. "Don't go soft now, Conrad," Sullivan warned, sensing my hesitation. "Think about the boy in the basement." I switched the feed back to the basement. Sammy was still there. He'd found the Jason Namuiban Jason had kicked away. He was sitting on the floor, leaning against the cold concrete wall, staring at the back of the paper. He was reading his grandmother's words over and over again. Suddenly, the basement door creaked open. It wasn't Jason, it was Valerie. She wasn't wearing her loving mother mask anymore. Her face was contorted with a vicious, survivalist hunger. She grabbed Sammy by the arm, yanking him to his feet. "Give me that," she snapped, snatching the bond from his hand. "No, that's mine. Grandpa gave it to me," Sammy cried. Valerie didn't even look at the writing on the back. She looked at the government seal. $50. It's the only thing in this house that isn't frozen. Come on, Sammy. We're leaving. Where's Dad? Your father is a failure, she hissed, dragging the boy toward the stairs. We're going to my sister's. And if your grandfather calls, you tell him you're scared. You tell him Jason hurt you. You make him feel like the monster he is, do you understand? He's the only one who can turn the money back on, and you're the only thing he cares about. I stood up so fast I knocked my chair over. She's going to use him as leverage, I growled. She's going to kidnap my grandson to blackmail me. Technically, she's his mother. Conrad, Sullivan said, his face grim. Until a court says otherwise, she has every right to take him wherever she wants. Not today, she doesn't. I grabbed my coat. Sullivan, tell the security team at the gate to let her out, but tell the tail car to follow her. Do not lose that Mercedes. If she takes him across state lines, I want the FBI involved before she hits the toll booth. Where are you going? I'm going to the office, I said, my eyes fixed on the screen as Valerie shoved Sammy into the back of her SUV. Jason is going to show up there any minute, thinking he still has a kingdom to command. I want to be the one who tells him he's trespassing. As I walked out of the penthouse, I realized I'd made a tactical error. I'd focused all my fire on Jason, thinking he was the threat. But Valerie, she was the one with the real stiletto. She didn't care about the company. She cared about the lifestyle. And she knew that the quickest way to a billionaire's wallet was through his heart. I stepped into the elevator, the silence of the building pressing in on me. I had stripped them of their power, their light, and their water. I had turned their home into a tomb. But in doing so, I'd forced the wolves out into the open. I didn't know it yet. I whispered to the empty elevator, but the hardest part of the war wasn't taking the money. It was realizing that my son wasn't just ungrateful. He was an accomplice to something much worse. The elevator doors opened to the lobby. My driver was waiting. The rain was pouring down now, a gray, dismal curtain over the city. To the King Logistics Tower, I told him, and drive fast. I have a meeting with a ghost. Little did I know, Jason was already there, and he wasn't alone. He'd called the one person I thought I'd never see again, the one person who hated me more than he did. The loop was closing, and the shadows of my own past were stepping out to meet me. The King Logistics Tower stands 60 stories tall, a monolith of glass and steel that reflects the Boston Harbor like a jagged mirror. I've always loved this building. I remember the day the final beam was placed. Catherine and I had stood on the sidewalk, craning our necks until they ached, watching our name being hoisted toward the clouds. Back then, the name King meant something. It meant a promise kept. It meant that if you put your cargo on one of our trucks or ships, it arrived on time, every time. But as my car pulled up to the curb, the building looked different. It looked cold. It looked like a fortress under siege. I stepped out into the rain, the heavy droplets drumming against my umbrella. The sidewalk was crowded with commuters, people rushing to work with their heads down, oblivious to the fact that the man who owned the pavement was walking among them. I felt a strange sense of invisibility. For 5 years, I'd been tucked away in a basement, and the world had moved on without me. I was a ghost in a bespoke suit, reclaiming a haunted house. As I entered the lobby, the air conditioning hit me like a wall of ice. The space was cavernous, filled with the echo of footsteps and the low murmur of the morning rush. I headed straight for the security desk. I saw him before he saw me. Jason was standing by the high-tech turnstiles, gesturing wildly at a young security guard who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. Jason's navy suit was rumpled, his shirt collar unbuttoned, and he was sweating despite the chill in the air. He looked like a man who had been running for hours and had finally hit a dead end. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Jason's voice carried across the lobby, sharp and desperate. "I am the CEO. I am the man who signs your checks. Open this gate right now, or I will have you on the street by noon." The guard, a kid named Leo, whose father I'd hired 20 years ago, kept his voice low and professional. "I'm sorry, Mr. King. The system has flagged your credentials as inactive. I have strict orders from the board and Mr. Sullivan. No one enters without a manual override." "Manual override? I am the override," Jason screamed, slamming his hand against the glass barrier. I stopped 10 feet away, watching my son unravel. It was a pathetic sight. He wasn't fighting for his honor. He was fighting for a badge he hadn't earned. He hadn't built this company. He'd merely inherited the keys and proceeded to change the locks. "He's not coming in, Leo," I said, my voice cutting through the lobby like a gunshot. Jason spun around. His eyes were bloodshot, his pupils dilated with a mix of exhaustion and pure, unadulterated fury. When he saw me, he didn't look remorseful. He didn't look like a son seeing a father. He looked like a cornered animal seeing the hunter. "You," he hissed, taking a step toward me. The security guards immediately shifted, their hands moving toward their belts. "You old bastard. You think this is funny? You think you can just flip a switch and take it all back? This is my life. I've been the face of this company while you were rotting in the basement." "You weren't the face of the company, Jason," I said, stepping closer until I could see the fine tremor in his jaw. "You were a mask, and the mask just fell off." I turned to the guards. "Escort him off the property. If he sets foot on the sidewalk of this block again, call the police and have him charged with trespassing." "You can't do this." Jason shrieked as 2 large men in tactical gear stepped toward him. "I have rights. I have a contract." "Your contract was with the trust, Jason, and the trust found you in breach," I said. As they grabbed his arms, Jason started to laugh. It wasn't the laugh of a sane man. It was a jagged, ugly sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. He stopped struggling and looked at me, a cruel, triumphant glint in his eyes that I didn't recognize. "You think you've won, don't you?" Jason whispered as they began to drag him toward the rotating doors. "You think you can just go back to the top floor and play king again. But I didn't just come here to get into my office, Dad. I came here to meet a friend." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" Jason looked past me, toward the elevators. "He's already upstairs, Dad. I called him last night. I told him the king was finally dead, and the kingdom was up for grabs. I signed the paperwork at Bonn, a.m., in a Haimui Bonauer diner. I sold him my personal shares, all of them." A cold dread began to seep into my bones. Jason didn't have enough shares to sell the company. I held the majority through the trust, but he had enough to cause a catastrophic internal war. "Who, Jason?" I demanded. "Who did you call?" "The only man who hates you as much as I do," Jason sneered. "Silas Vane." The name hit me like a physical blow. I felt the breath leave my lungs. Silas Vane wasn't just an enemy. He was the shadow I'd spent 30 years trying to outrun. We had been partners in the early days, back when King Logistics was just 3 trucks and a rented garage. But Silas was greedy. He wanted to cut corners. He wanted to run gray cargo things that didn't belong on a manifest. I'd forced him out, stripped him of his stake, and sent him to prison for 3 years on a tax evasion charge I'd orchestrated. I thought I'd buried him. I thought he was a ghost. "He's in your office, Dad." Jason laughed as the guards pushed him through the glass doors into the rain. "He's sitting in your chair, and since he now owns 20% of the voting stock, you can't kick him out without a board meeting. Welcome back to the war, old man." The doors swung shut, cutting off Jason's laughter. I stood in the center of the lobby, my heart hammering. I'd focused so much on the doomsday clause, so much on the financial execution of my son, that I hadn't considered the possibility of him burning the village to spite the chief. "Conrad?" Sullivan was suddenly at my side, his face ashen. He'd just come down from the executive floors. "We have a problem." "I know. Silas Vane is upstairs." "It's worse than that," Sullivan whispered, leaning in so the curious bystanders couldn't hear. "He didn't just buy Jason's shares. He's brought a team of forensic accountants. He's claiming that the doomsday clause is a violation of shareholder rights and that your move last night was an act of corporate sabotage. He's filing for an emergency injunction to freeze the trust itself. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. If the trust was frozen, I couldn't move the money back. I couldn't pay the employees. I couldn't even pay for the safe house. I'd be as broke as Jason was 5 minutes ago. "And Valerie?" I asked, my voice tight. "She's not at her sister's," Sullivan said, checking his phone. "The tail car lost her near the waterfront. She switched vehicles. But Conrad, look at the news." He handed me his tablet. A headline was scrolling across the bottom of the local news feed. "Shocking allegations. Wife of displaced CO claims elder abuse and mental instability at King Logistics." There was a video. It was Valerie, standing in front of a grainy background, looking tearful and exhausted. She wasn't the polished socialite anymore. She looked like a victim. "My father-in-law, Conrad King, has been suffering from severe dementia for years," she sobbed into the camera. "We kept him at home to protect his dignity, but last night he snapped. He's cut off our water, our heat, and kidnapped my son. He's using the company's resources to hold us hostage. I'm terrified for Sammy's safety." "She's playing the Senile billionaire card," I muttered, the irony tasting like copper in my mouth. "She's doing more than that," Sullivan said. "She's filed a missing persons report for Sammy. The police aren't looking for Jason anymore. They're looking for you. They think you've taken the boy and disappeared into a psychotic break." I looked up at the ceiling of the lobby, toward the 60th floor where Silas Vane was sitting in my chair. I looked at the doors where my son had just been dragged out in shame. I looked at the tablet where my daughter-in-law was destroying my reputation in real time. I'd thought I was the one setting the trap. I'd thought I was the one playing God. But in my arrogance, I'd forgotten the one rule of the docks. When you aim for the heart, you'd better not miss. I hadn't missed Jason's heart. I'd just forgotten that he didn't have one to begin with. He'd traded his soul to Silas Vane just to see me bleed. "What do we do, Conrad?" Sullivan asked. "The police will be here in minutes. If you're found here, they'll take you in for psychiatric evaluation, and Vane will have total control of the building by lunch." I looked at the elevator. I could hear the sirens in the distance, a faint, wailing chorus echoing through the Boston streets. I had two choices. I could run and become the fugitive they wanted me to be, or I could go upstairs and face the man I'd spent 30 years trying to forget. "Tell the driver to pull around to the service entrance," I said, my voice cold and hard. "You're leaving?" "No," I said, handing the umbrella to a stunned Leo. "I'm going to the roof. If Silas Vane wants to take my company, he's going to have to watch me do something he never had the guts to do." "Conrad, what are you planning?" "I'm going to use the one thing Jason forgot I had," I said, stepping toward the service elevator. "The truth. And I'm going to broadcast it from the top of this damn building until the whole city knows exactly what kind of snakes are crawling through the King's Garden." But as the elevator doors began to close, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an unknown number. I swiped to answer. "Grandpa." It was Sammy. His voice was small, muffled, and thick with terror. "Sammy, where are you? Are you with your mother?" "No," Sammy sobbed. "I'm in a dark room, Grandpa. There are lots of boxes. And a man. He says I have to wait here until the deal is done. He says if I make a noise, you'll never find us." A cold, sharp realization pierced my mind. Silas Vane didn't just have the shares. He had the boy. And Jason, my own son, had handed him the coordinates. I gripped the handrail of the elevator so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't know it yet, but the doomsday clause was about to become a literal prophecy. "Sammy, listen to me," I whispered. "Do you see any light? Any windows?" "Just a small one. High up," Sammy said. "I can see a big gold K on a building across the street. It's upside down, Grandpa." The K on the warehouse in South Boston, the old garage, where it all began. The elevator hit the roof. The doors opened to the howling wind and the gray sky. I stepped out onto the helipad, the city stretching out beneath me like a map of my failures. I had 40 minutes before the police arrived. 40 minutes to save my grandson and stop an old ghost from stealing my legacy. But as I looked toward South Boston, I saw a black SUV speeding toward the old warehouse, and I realized that Jason wasn't just an accomplice, he was the bait. The wind on the roof of the King Logistics Tower didn't just blow, it screamed. It whipped around the edges of the helipad, tearing at my coat and stinging my eyes with freezing rain. Down below, the city of Boston was a blur of gray and flashing blue lights. The sirens were closer now. I could hear them wailing like banshees, a rhythmic warning that my time as a free man was leaking away like water through a cracked hull. I stood there, clutching my phone to my ear, listening to the static on the other end of the line after Sammy's call went dead. My grandson was in a dark room with boxes. He could see an upside-down K. The old garage. Boncham Bonmui High, West 2nd Street. It was the place where I had overhauled my first engine. The place where Catherine used to bring me lukewarm coffee and sandwiches in wax paper while I stayed up until 3 in the morning, trying to figure out how to afford a second truck. It was our foundation. And now, Silas Vane had turned it into a prison for my blood. "Sullivan," I said into the phone, my voice barely audible over the gale. "Tell the driver to meet me at the service exit. Forget the office. Forget the board. We're going to South Boston." "Conrad, the police are already in the lobby." Sullivan's voice was frantic. "If you go down there, they'll pin the kidnapping on you. Valerie's video is already viral. The narrative is set. You're the unhinged billionaire who took the kid. If you show up at that warehouse, you're walking into a kill zone." "I don't care about the narrative, Sullivan. I care about the boy. Silas Vane doesn't take prisoners. He takes trophies. If I don't get to Sammy now, Silas will ensure the King legacy ends with a funeral." I didn't wait for his reply. I ducked back into the stairwell, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every flight of stairs felt like a mile. My knees burned, a sharp, stabbing reminder of the 70 years I had lived and the 5 years I had spent rot in a basement. But as I descended, the exhaustion didn't slow me down. It fueled me. I had built this empire to give my son a better life. I had worked until my hands bled so he wouldn't have to. And in return, he had handed my grandson over to a snake just to get his hands back on a bank account. The betrayal wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a cold, heavy weight. It was the realization that I hadn't raised a son, I had raised a parasite. I had mistaken his greed for ambition and his arrogance for confidence. I was the one who had given him the poison, and now I was the only one who could provide the antidote. I reached the service level, the smell of diesel and trash filling my lungs. My driver, a man named Elias, who had stayed loyal even when the checks stopped coming, had the black sedan idling by the loading dock. "South Boston," I growled, sliding into the back seat. "And Elias, break every law you have to. We don't have time for red lights." The car roared to life, tires screeching against the wet pavement as we surged into the street. Through the tinted windows, I saw the police cruisers pulling up to the front of the tower. They were looking for a man in a penthouse. They didn't realize the king had already left the castle. As we tore through the rain-slicked streets of the seaport, my phone buzzed again. It was a FaceTime request. I hesitated, then swiped. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't Sammy. It was Silas Vane. He looked exactly the same, which was the most terrifying thing about him. His hair was perfectly silver, his tan was artificial, and his eyes were as empty as a dry well. He was sitting in a folding chair, the background filled with the rusted iron beams and stacked shipping crates of my old garage. "Conrad," Silas purred. His voice was like silk over sandpaper. "It's been a long time. You look tired. The basement life didn't suit you. I take it? Where is he, Silas? If you've touched a hair on his head." "Oh, the boy is fine," Silas interrupted, tilting the camera. I caught a glimpse of Sammy sitting on a crate in the corner, his hands zip-tied, his eyes wide with terror. A man I didn't recognize, one of Silas's thugs, stood over him. "He's a brave little king. Reminds me of you, actually. Before you got soft and started worrying about things like ethics and pensions. What do you want, Silas? You have the shares. You have the leverage. Just let him go." Silas laughed, a dry, wheezing sound. "I don't just want the company, Conrad. I want the satisfaction. Do you remember what you said to me 30 years ago? When you had the cops haul me out of that garage in handcuffs. You said I was a stain on the name. You said the kings were built on honor." He leaned closer to the camera, his face twisted in a sneer. "Look at your honor now. Your son sold me those shares for 10 cents on the dollar, and a promise that I'd let him stay on as a consultant. He's right here, actually. Want to say hi to Dad, Jason?" The camera panned. My son was sitting on the floor a few feet away, but he wasn't the arrogant CEO from the restaurant. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. He looked broken. He looked like he'd finally realized that when you make a deal with the devil, you don't get a seat at the table, you get the scraps under it. "Dad," Jason's voice was a pathetic croak. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't think he'd take Sammy. He said he just wanted the leverage." He said, "Shut up, Jason," I said, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "You don't get to be sorry. You traded your son for a title. You're not a king. You're not even a man." Silas turned the camera back to himself. "Enough family drama. Here's the deal, Conrad. You're heading to the warehouse. I know your GPS. I know your driver. When you arrive, you walk in alone. You bring the physical ledger for the trust, the one with the bypass codes you never digitized. You hand it over, you sign the full dissolution papers, and I let the boy go. And Jason?" Silas shrugged. "Jason is a bad investment. I'll leave him for the police. With Valerie's elder abuse story and the missing person report, Jason is the perfect fall guy. By tonight, the world will think Jason kidnapped the boy and tried to extort you, and I'll be the white knight who stepped in to save the company from a collapsing family. You think the board will follow you? The board follows money, Conrad, and I have more of it than you do right now. 10 minutes. If you're not through those doors in 10 minutes, I start sending the boy back to you one piece at a time." The screen went black. I stared at my reflection in the dead phone. I looked like a man who had reached the end of his rope. But Silas Vane had made one catastrophic mistake. He thought he knew me because he knew the man I was 30 years ago. He thought I was still playing by the rules of honor and legacy. He didn't realize that 5 years in a basement had stripped away the businessman. It had left something much more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose. "Elias," I said, my voice dropping to a low lethal register, "do you still have the contact for those private contractors we used during the dock strikes in Chinwitam? The ones who don't exist on paper?" Elias glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes widening. "The ones who handle the heavy lifting, sir. The ones who know how to clear a room without making a sound. Call them. Tell them I'm paying triple, and tell them to meet us at the back entrance of the 2nd Street garage. We're not going in for a negotiation." "What about the ledger, sir?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the Namui Treasury bond. I looked at the gold frame I'd put it in. I looked at Catherine's handwriting on the back. "I'm bringing the only value I have left," I said. As we pulled into the gravel lot of the old warehouse, the rain turned into a downpour. The building was a dark, hulking shadow against the gray sky. It looked exactly as it had 40 years ago, decrepit, forgotten, and full of secrets. I stepped out of the car. The water soaked through my suit instantly, but I didn't feel it. I walked toward the front door. The Plan Namui bond clutched in my hand. I didn't know it yet, but the betrayal was about to go one level deeper. I thought I was walking into a trap set by Silas and Jason. I thought Valerie was just a mouthpiece on the news. But as I reached for the rusted handle of the warehouse door, I saw a familiar pair of designer heels sitting neatly by the entrance, shielded from the rain. Valerie's heels. The loving mother wasn't at her sister's. She wasn't at a news station. She was inside, and as the door creaked open, I realized that the Doomsday Clause hadn't just destroyed my son's life. It had triggered a war between 3 people who had spent 5 years pretending to love me, only to find out they all hated each other even more. "Come in, Conrad," a voice called out from the shadows. It wasn't Silas. It was Valerie, and she was holding the gun. The smell of the old warehouse at Bonchambonmuihai West 2nd Street hadn't changed in 40 years. It was a thick, cloying mixture of rusted iron, spilled diesel, and the damp, heavy scent of the Boston harbor. It was the smell of my youth, the smell of struggle. But as I stepped through the heavy steel door, it felt like I was walking into the belly of a beast that had finally decided to swallow me whole. I stood in the doorway, the rain dripping from the hem of my charcoal coat, forming a dark puddle on the cracked concrete floor. The warehouse was cavernous, illuminated only by a few flickering industrial lamps hanging from the rafters and the frantic, sweeping beams of the storm outside, visible through the high, broken windows. In the center of the floor, beneath the yellow glow of a single bulb, sat Valerie. She wasn't huddled in a corner. She wasn't crying. She was sitting in a high-backed wooden chair, the very same chair I used to sit in while I balanced the books in Mutngin Chin Chumbai Mutam. She looked impeccably cold, her hair damp but perfectly styled, her eyes fixed on me with a clarity that made my blood run cold. And in her right hand, resting casually on the arm of the chair, was a compact silver semi-automatic. It pointed toward the floor, but the message was loud enough to rattle the rafters. "Close the door, Conrad," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't have the hysterical edge of the woman on the news. It was the voice of a woman who had finally stopped playing a character. "You're letting the draft in, and I've spent quite enough time being cold lately." I pushed the door shut behind me. The heavy clack of the latch echoed through the space like a tomb ceiling. I didn't look at the gun. I looked past her. In the shadows to the left, Silas Vane was leaning against a stack of crates, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked annoyed, like a theater director whose lead actress had just decided to ad-lib her own ending. And on the floor to the right, slumped against a rusted support beam, was Jason. He looked worse than he had on the FaceTime call. His face was a map of bruises, his expensive suit shredded. But more than the physical damage, it was the look in his eyes, a hollow, shattered vacuum of a man who realized he wasn't even the protagonist of his own betrayal. And then I saw Sammy. He was tucked behind a row of wooden pallets, zip-tied to a metal shelving unit. He looked so small, so fragile. His eyes were red from crying, but when they met mine, I saw a spark of hope that nearly broke my resolve. I had to stay the shark. If I let the grandfather show through, we were both dead. "I expected Silas," I said, my voice steady, projecting that old Shark King authority. "I expected my son's cowardice. But you, Valerie? I didn't think you had the stomach for the grease." Valerie let out a short, sharp laugh. "The grease? Conrad, I've been living in the grease for years. I spent 5 years smiling at you while you smelled like a basement. I spent 5 years pretending your boring stories about the good old days were anything but a chore. I did the work. I managed the social optics. I made Jason look like a man when he was barely a boy." She stood up, the gun now leveled at my chest. "Jason was supposed to be the one to do it. He was supposed to convince you to hand over the power years ago, but he was too soft, too desperate for his daddy's approval. Even when he was stealing from you, he was doing it like a guilty child." "So you decided to partner with a man I sent to prison?" I asked, glancing at Silas. "Partner," Silas interjected, stepping forward into the light. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Valerie. She was a source of information, Conrad. She's the one who told me about the trust's vulnerability. She's the one who gave me the access codes to Jason's personal accounts so I could see exactly how much he was skimming. She played the both of you. I played for my future," Valerie snapped, her eyes never leaving mine. "Silas promised me a 50-50 split of the liquidated assets. He gets the company, I get the cash. And Jason? Well, Jason was always going to be the tragedy we could blame it on." I looked at Jason. He was staring at his wife as if she were a stranger who had just dropped from the ceiling. "Val, you told me we were doing this for us. You said we'd move to Switzerland." "Oh, Jason," she said, her voice dripping with a pity that was more painful than a slap. "You can't even move a chair without your father's permission. Why would I want to take you to Switzerland?" It was a cold-blooded theater of the absurd. My son, the man who had tried to drug me and strip me of my sanity, was being discarded by the woman he had sold his soul to please. "The ledger, Conrad," Silas said, reaching out an open hand. "Valerie is getting impatient, and as you can see, she's a bit of a wild card. Give me the physical book, the one with the manual override codes for the offshore holdings, the codes that don't exist on any server." I reached into my jacket pocket. I felt the weight of the Nummuy Treasury bond in its gold frame. It was a piece of paper that represented a legacy, but in this room, it was a joke. I also felt the burner phone in my other pocket, the one that was currently connected to Elias, and the heavy lifters waiting at the back entrance. I didn't pull out the ledger. I didn't have it. The ledger was in a vault in Zurich that Silas would never see. "The ledger isn't coming, Silas," I said. Valerie's thumb flicked the safety off. The click was the loudest sound in the world. "Don't lie to me, Conrad. I saw you leave the penthouse with a briefcase." "That briefcase had a change of clothes and a bottle of scotch," I said. "You want the codes? They're in my head. And they're in the heads of 3 men sitting in a secure facility in London who have instructions to delete every cent in the King family trust if I don't check in every 12 hours. I took a step forward, ignoring the barrel of the gun. "You think you've trapped me? You've trapped yourselves. If I die in this warehouse, the money vanishes. The company accounts lock permanently. The ships stop in the middle of the ocean. The trucks pull over to the side of the road. And Silas, the gray cargo you've been running for the last 6 months, the stuff you thought I didn't know about, will be flagged by the DEA within the hour." Silas's face changed. The smug, silver-haired tycoon vanished, replaced by the panicked criminal I'd seen 30 years ago. "What are you talking about?" You didn't think I was just sitting in the basement playing with my stamp collection, did you? I asked. I knew you were back. I knew Jason was talkative. I've been tracking your shipments for 90 days. I have the manifests. I have the photos of the medical supplies being loaded in Panama. It's all in the doomsday clause, Silas. It's a self-destruct sequence. Silas turned to Valerie, his eyes darting. He's bluffing. He wouldn't destroy his own empire. He destroyed my life in a single morning, Silas, Valerie screamed. He would absolutely do it. She turned back to me, the gun shaking now. Turn it on, Conrad. Give us the codes. Give me the money, or I swear to God, I'll start with the boy. She swung the gun toward Sammy. No, Jason yelled, finally finding his voice, trying to scramble to his feet. Silas kicked him back down, a casual, brutal movement of his boot. I stayed perfectly still. I didn't blink. I didn't beg. I looked Valerie in the eye. If you kill him, you have nothing. No leverage, no money, no future. You'll just be a woman in a wet dress in a dirty warehouse with a dead child and a life sentence. Is that the lifestyle you were aiming for? The tension in the room was a physical weight. I could hear the rain pounding on the roof, the rhythm of a clock ticking toward zero. I was waiting for the signal. I was waiting for Elias. Suddenly, a low, guttural vibration shook the floor. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of a heavy industrial engine revving outside the back-loading dock. What is that? Silas hissed, pulling a handgun from his waistband. That, I said, is the sound of the old school coming back to work. The back wall of the warehouse, a series of rusted rolling doors, didn't open. They exploded. A massive King Logistics tractor trailer, the grill reinforced with a heavy steel push bar, smashed through the doors, the sound of tearing metal like a scream of a giant. It skidded across the floor, the headlights blinding Silas and Valerie, the air brakes hissing like a dragon. Sammy, get down, I roared. In the confusion, Valerie fired. The muzzle flash was a blinding spark in the gloom. I felt a searing heat rip across my shoulder, a white-hot iron that knocked me backward. I hit the floor, the world spinning, the taste of copper and dust in my mouth. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I saw the doors of the truck fly open. 2 men in black tactical gear, the heavy lifters, dropped out, silenced submachine guns raised. They weren't police. They weren't looking to make arrests. They were there to clear the room. "Kill them!" Silas screamed, firing wildly toward the truck. Valerie was panicked now, looking between me, the truck, and the exit. She aimed at Sammy again, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated spite. If she couldn't have the money, she would have my heart. But before she could pull the trigger, a shadow moved from the pallets. It was Jason. He didn't have a gun. He didn't have a plan. But he had the one thing he'd been missing for 40 years. A backbone. He lunged at Valerie, his battered body moving with a sudden, desperate speed. He didn't tackle her. He threw himself in front of the barrel. The second shot rang out. I saw Jason jerk, his body absorbing the impact, his momentum carrying him into Valerie. They went down together in a heap of silk and blood. The tactical team moved in like shadows. Silas didn't even have time to fire another round. 2 muffled twips and Silas Vane collapsed, his knees buckling, his eyes wide with the realization that he'd been outplayed by a man he thought was obsolete. The warehouse fell into a sudden, terrifying silence. I crawled across the floor, my shoulders screaming in protest, my vision blurring. I didn't go to Silas. I didn't go to the money. I went to the pallets. "Sammy," I wheezed, my fingers fumbling with the zip ties. "Sammy, look at me." Sammy was shaking, his face pale, but he was alive. He looked at me, then at the 2 figures tangled on the floor 10 feet away. Grandpa is Dad. I got the ties off. I pulled him into my arms, the smell of the damp warehouse finally being replaced by the scent of the boy I had fought to save. I held him so tight I thought I might break him. "He's okay, Sammy. He's going to be okay." I looked over my shoulder. Valerie was struggling, pinned under Jason's weight, her face covered in his blood. She was screaming, a sound of pure animal frustration. My son was lying still, his eyes closed, his breathing ragged and wet. He had taken the bullet meant for the only thing he had left. I stood up, clutching Sammy to my side. I looked at the tactical team leader, a man I'd known since the docks were made of wood. "Call the paramedics," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "And call Sullivan. Tell him the purge is complete." I walked toward the exit, my shoulder bleeding, my heart heavy with a victory that felt like a funeral. But as I reached the door, I felt something in my pocket, the gold-framed bond. I didn't know it yet, but the final secret Catherine had left wasn't on the back of the paper. It was in the very existence of the warehouse itself. As I stepped out into the rain, I saw the police cruisers finally arriving, their sirens a blue and red mosaic against the dark. But they weren't alone. Another car pulled up, a sleek, black government vehicle. The game wasn't over. It had just moved from the street to the state house, and the woman who had spent 5 years in my basement was about to find out that a doomsday clause has more than one meaning. The flashing lights of the police cruisers transformed the falling rain into a chaotic mosaic of red and blue, a neon funeral for the life I'd lived for the last 5 years. I stood on the asphalt of the warehouse lot, my shoulder a numb, throbbing weight, holding Sammy's hand with a grip that I knew was probably too tight. He was shaking, a rhythmic tremor that traveled through his small arm and into my soul. Across the lot, the paramedics were loading Jason onto a gurney. His face was a pale, waxen mask, the oxygen mask fogging with each ragged, shallow breath. I watched them hoist him into the ambulance, the doors slamming shut with a finality that made my stomach churn. He had taken a bullet for his son. It was the first honest thing he'd done in a decade, and it might be the last thing he ever did. Then there was Valerie. She wasn't on a gurney. She was being led toward a cruiser in handcuffs, her silk dress torn and stained with my son's blood. She was screaming not out of grief, not out of remorse, but out of a pure, incandescent rage. "He's crazy," she shrieked, her eyes wild as she spotted me standing in the shadows. "He orchestrated the whole thing. He's a sick old man. Look at him. He kidnapped my son. He lured us here to kill us." An officer stepped in front of me, his hand on his holster. He looked at my bloody shoulder, then at the terrified boy at my side. "Mr. King, I'm going to need you to step away from the child and come with us. There's a psychiatric hold order with your name on it, signed by a judge 3 hours ago." I looked at the officer. He was young. He saw a bleeding old man and a crying child. He saw the narrative Valerie had spent 24 hours building on every news channel in the city. "Sullivan," I said, not moving an inch. Sullivan stepped out from behind the black government vehicle that had pulled up seconds after the police. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a man in a charcoal suit with a federal badge pinned to his lapel, Agent Miller, a man whose career I had quietly funded back when he was a beat cop in Southie. "The psychiatric hold is being vacated as we speak, officer," Sullivan said, his voice as sharp as a razor. "The judge who signed it was presented with a fraudulent medical file provided by Dr. Silas Vane, who is currently being treated for 2 gunshot wounds in that warehouse. This is no longer a local matter. This is a federal kidnapping and RICO investigation." Agent Miller stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Valerie. "Mrs. King, you are being detained under the King-Vane Racketeering Act. We've been monitoring Silas Vane's communications for 6 months. We have your voice, on tape, negotiating the sale of stolen corporate assets in exchange for the abduction of a minor." Valerie's jaw dropped. The victim mask shattered, leaving behind the jagged, ugly reality of the woman who had lived in my house. You had a wire? In the warehouse?" "In the warehouse," I said, my voice finally finding its cold iron center. "And in the basement, and in the kitchen. Did you really think I'd live in a room for 5 years without knowing exactly who was walking over my head?" The officers led her away. She didn't scream anymore. She went silent, a cold, calculating look entering her eyes. She was already thinking about her defense, already looking for the next man to manipulate. I watched the cruiser pull away, the red lights fading into the dark. "Conrad," Sullivan said, placing a hand on my good shoulder. "We need to get you to the hospital. That wound needs a surgeon, not a bandage." "Not yet," I said. "I need to see Silas." I walked back into the warehouse. The tactical team had cleared the room, but the air still tasted of ozone and copper. Silas Vane was sitting on the floor, propped up against a crate, a medic working on his leg. He looked up at me as I approached. He didn't look scared. He looked impressed. "You always were a stubborn old goat, Conrad," he wheezed. "You really burned it all down. For what? A grandson who won't remember you in 10 years? A son who's probably going to die on an operating table?" "I didn't burn it down, Silas," I said, leaning over him until he could see the reflection of his own failure in my eyes. "I just performed a controlled demolition of the rot. You were the termite. My son was the wood. I'm the one who owns the land. You have nothing left." Silas sneered. "The shares are tied up in litigation for the next decade. The board is in chaos. You're 70 years old. You'll be dead before the first court date. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the Namui Treasury bond. I held it up. You and Jason spent so much time looking at the numbers on the screen. I said, you forgot how to read the fine print. You think you bought 20% of the voting stock? Look at the back of the bond, Silas. The real back. I peeled away a thin, translucent layer of film on the gold frame. Underneath, etched into the very metal of the frame itself, was a microscopic series of alphanumeric characters. The Doomsday Clause wasn't just a legal filing, I whispered. It was a blockchain encryption key. When Jason sold you those shares, he was selling you a hollow shell. The actual ownership of the King Logistics infrastructure, the ships, the trucks, the licenses, was never held by the trust. It was held by a private entity that only this key can unlock. It's a dead man's switch. Since I'm still alive, those shares you bought are worth exactly what Jason thought this bond was worth. Silas's eyes widened. He tried to lunge forward, but the medic pushed him back. You bastard. You let him sell me air? I let him sell you a prison sentence, I said. The moment you purchased those shares with the money from your Panama accounts, you admitted to money laundering through a shell company. Agent Miller has the paper trail. You didn't steal my company, Silas. You bought a front row seat to your own execution. I turned and walked away, leaving him shouting obscenities into the rafters. The hospital was a blur of white hallways and the smell of antiseptic. They took Sammy to a private room to be checked over by a pediatrician I'd known for 30 years. I sat in the waiting room of the surgical wing, my arm in a sling, watching the clock. Sullivan sat next to me, a stack of files on his lap. Jason is out of surgery. The bullet missed the heart, but the lung took a hit. He's stable, Conrad. But the police are waiting outside his room. Good, I said. What do you want to do about the custody? Sullivan asked. With Valerie in federal custody and Jason facing conspiracy charges, Sammy is technically a ward of the state tonight. Not while I'm breathing, I said. I've already filed the emergency papers. Judge Miller is signing them as we speak. I'm his guardian. He's going to live with me. In the penthouse? No, I said, looking out the window at the distant harbor. In a house with a yard, a house with stairs that aren't treacherous, and a house where the basement is just a place for a laundry machine, not a human being. I stood up and walked toward the recovery room. I saw Jason through the glass. He was hooked up to a dozen machines, his face thin and gray. He looked so much like the boy who used to cry when he fell off his bike. I didn't feel the triumph I thought I would. I felt a profound, aching sadness. I had won the war, but I had lost my son a long time ago. I had spent 40 years trying to build a kingdom for a prince who only wanted the gold from the crown. I walked into the room. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss-thump of the ventilator. I sat down in the chair next to the bed and took his hand. It felt cold. I didn't know it yet. I whispered to the silent room, but the hardest part of the revenge wasn't seeing them fall. It was realizing that even after everything, I still wanted to catch them. Suddenly, Jason's eyes fluttered open. He looked at me, his pupils clouded with morphine and pain. He saw the sling on my arm. He saw the tears in my eyes. "Dad!" he croaked, the word barely a breath. "I'm here, Jason. Sammy is he. He's safe. He's upstairs." Jason closed his eyes, a single tear tracking through the grime on his cheek. I threw it away. The bond. "It doesn't matter," I said. "It was garbage," he whispered, his voice fading. "I was garbage." "You were lost," I said, though I didn't know if I believed it. "Dad, why didn't you kill me?" I looked at my son, the man who had tried to erase me, the man who had traded his soul for a title. I looked at the hands I had taught to hold a steering wheel. "Because the Doomsday Clause has a final paragraph, Jason," I said, leaning in close. "One that Silas never saw, one that Valerie never knew about." Jason looked at me, a flicker of curiosity in his dying gaze. "It says that the King legacy isn't about the money," I whispered. "It's about the return on investment. And you finally gave me a return worth keeping. You saved the boy." Jason's hand twitched in mine. He didn't speak again. He drifted back into the narcotic fog, but for the first time in 5 years, the air between us didn't taste of bitterness. I walked out of the room and headed for the elevator. I had one more stop to make. I went to the pediatric wing. Sammy was sitting up in bed, eating a bowl of chocolate pudding. He looked up when I walked in, and his face lit up like a lighthouse in a storm. "Grandpa." I sat on the edge of his bed. "Hey, kiddo, ready to go home?" "To the mansion?" Sammy asked, his voice dropping. "No," I said, ruffling his hair. "To a new place. A place with a big kitchen and a library full of books. And Sammy, tomorrow morning, we're going to the bank." "The bank? Why?" I pulled the Tao Numui bond from my pocket. The gold frame was scratched, the glass cracked from the warehouse floor. I handed it to him. "Because we're going to open a new account," I said. "An account for a man who knows that $50 is just a seed. Do you know what you do with a seed, Sammy?" Sammy looked at the bond, then at me. "You plant it, Grandpa." "That's right," I said, "and you watch it grow, and you never, ever let anyone tell you it's garbage." As I walked out of the hospital with my grandson's hand in mine, I saw the morning sun breaking through the Boston clouds. The city was waking up. The trucks were starting their routes. The ships were entering the harbor. The King Empire was still standing. But as I looked at the boy at my side, I realized the real empire wasn't made of steel or glass. It was made of the stories we tell and the people we save. Jason was alive, but he was headed for prison. Valerie was gone. Silas was broken. The purge was over. But the final twist, the one that would change everything, was waiting for me in a small, blue envelope that Sullivan handed me as we reached the car. "What's this?" I asked. "It's from the paternity lab, Conrad," Sullivan said, his face unreadable. "The one from Motngin Chin Cham Tamwibon, the one you told Jason about." I opened the envelope. I read the single page inside, and as I did, the ground truly disappeared from beneath my feet. The blue envelope felt heavier than the millions of dollars I had just moved across the globe. I sat in the back of the Cadillac, the morning sun finally burning through the Boston fog, while Sammy slept beside me, his head resting on my leg. I didn't want to open it. I knew that once I broke the seal, the last 5 decades of my life would be reframed, and I wasn't sure if I had enough strength left to see the picture. Sullivan watched me through the rearview mirror. His face was a mask of professional stillness, but I could see the tightness in his jaw. He had been with me since the first truck. He knew everything. Or at least, I thought he did. I slid my thumb under the flap and tore it open. The paper was crisp, the ink fresh. It wasn't the yellowed document I had brandished in the courtroom. That one, the Motngin Chin Cham Tamwibon report that claimed Jason wasn't my son, had been a masterwork of forgery. I had instructed Sullivan to create it because I needed a surgical strike. I needed to bypass the direct biological descendant clause of the trust to strip Jason of his standing instantly. I had used a lie about my late wife's virtue to kill the man my son had become. I had told myself it was for the greater good. I had told myself it was the only way to save Sammy. But as I read the real report, the one Agent Miller's team had pulled from the hospital's secure archives during the investigation, my hands began to shake. Probability of paternity, 9.5% Jason was mine. He had always been mine. There was no tennis instructor. There was no affair. Catherine had been as loyal to me as the stars are to the sky. I had dragged her name through the mud of a family court to win a war against my own flesh and blood. I had won the kingdom, but I had done it by poisoning the well. "You knew," I whispered, looking at Sullivan in the mirror. "I suspected," Sullivan said, his voice low. "But you gave an order, Conrad. You said to execute the Doomsday Clause by any means necessary. You told me that Jason had forfeited his right to the truth the moment he tried to drug you. I did what was required to protect the legacy." "The legacy," I scoffed, looking down at Sammy's peaceful face. "What legacy? I've turned my son into a pariah and my wife's memory into a weapon." "You saved the boy," Sullivan reminded me, "and you stopped Silas Vane. If you hadn't lied in that courtroom, Silas would still have those shares. Jason would still be his puppet. Sammy would still be in that warehouse. You traded a lie for a life, Conrad. Most men would call that a bargain. I didn't feel like I'd made a bargain. I felt like I'd finally become the shark everyone always said I was." The months that followed were a blur of legal cleanups and quiet reconstructions. Silas Vane's empire was dismantled by the federal government, his assets seized under RICO laws. He died in a prison hospital 6 months later, alone and forgotten, a man who had spent his life chasing a crown that never fit. Valerie fared no better. The loving mother defense crumbled the moment the warehouse recordings were played for a jury. Between the kidnapping, the the conspiracy to commit murder, and the mountain of financial fraud Sullivan unearthed. She was sentenced to 20 years. I watched her being led away from the sentencing hearing. She didn't look like a socialite anymore. She looked like a hollowed-out ghost. She tried to catch my eye, one last plea for a deal, but I looked right through her. To me, she was the rust that had eaten my son's heart. And then there was Jason. He survived the surgery, but the bullet had left him with more than just a physical scar. He was sentenced to 12 years for his role in the embezzlement and the conspiracy with Silas. Because he had taken the bullet for Sammy, the judge had shown a sliver of leniency, but there was no escaping the debt he owed to the state. A year after the night at the warehouse, I found myself standing in the visitor's room of a minimum security facility in upstate New York. I was wearing a simple gray suit, no gold watch, no platinum links. I was just an old man with a plastic tray of vending machine coffee. Jason was led into the room. He looked different. The arrogance had been bled out of him. He was thinner, his hair cropped short, his eyes clear for the first time since he was a teenager. He sat down across from me, the glass barrier between us, a cold reminder of the 5 years I'd spent in his basement. "Dad," he said. His voice was steady. "Jason." We sat in silence for a long time. There was so much to say that it felt easier to say nothing at all. I thought about the DNA report sitting in my safe. I thought about the lie I'd told the world. "Sammy is doing well," I said finally. "He's at the top of his class. He's playing baseball. He asks about you." Jason looked down at his hands, the hands that had once snatched a Namui bond with such contempt. Tell him, I'm studying. Tell him I'm learning how to build something." "I will." Jason looked up, his eyes searching mine. "The DNA test, Dad! In the courtroom. You told me I wasn't yours." I felt the weight of the secret pressing against my tongue. I could tell him the truth. I could tell him he was a king by blood. I could give him back his identity. But then I looked at the man he was becoming in this cell, a man who was finally taking responsibility for his own life instead of leaning on a name he hadn't earned. "Does it matter, Jason?" I asked softly. Jason smiled, a small, sad flick of his lips. "No, I suppose it doesn't. You raised me. You gave me everything, and I threw it away. Whether we share blood or not, I'm the one who failed the name. I'm the one who didn't understand the value of the bond." "You saved Sammy," I said. "That's the only investment that matters now. I'm sorry, Dad, for the basement, for Valerie, for everything." "I know," I said, and for the first time I actually believed him. I left the prison and drove back to the city. I didn't go to the King Logistics Tower. I had sold the company 6 months prior. I'd kept the name, but I'd liquidated the assets, ensuring the employees' pensions were tripled and the legacy was dissolved into a series of charitable trusts. I didn't want to be the Shark King anymore. I wanted to be a grandfather. I pulled up to a modest house in the suburbs, a house with a porch, a big yard, and a basement that was filled with Sammy's old toys, and a workbench where we spent our Saturday afternoons. Sammy was in the driveway, throwing a ball against the garage door. He saw the car and ran toward me. "Grandpa, you're back. Did you get the stuff?" "I did," I said, stepping out of the car. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside wasn't a watch or a ring. It was the Namui Treasury bond, now fully matured. I had taken it out of the gold frame. It was just a piece of paper again, wrinkled and stained, but it was the most valuable thing I owned. "Today's the day, Sammy," I said. "It's been 10 years since I bought this. Do you know what we're going to do with it?" "We're going to the bank?" "No," I said, leading him toward the backyard. "We're going to use it to buy a tree, a real one, a king oak, and we're going to plant it right in the center of the yard." We spent the afternoon digging. My shoulder ached, and my back protested, but I didn't stop until the roots were deep in the earth. We watered it together, the sun setting behind the trees, casting long, golden shadows across the grass. "Grandpa?" Sammy asked, looking up at me. "Yeah, kiddo? Why did Dad hate the paper so much? It's just $50. I sat down on the grass, pulling him onto my lap. "Because your dad thought that value was something you could see in a bank account, Sammy. He thought that being a king meant you were better than other people. He didn't understand that the real value of a gift isn't what it's worth today. It's what it becomes if you're patient enough to care for it." I looked at the small sapling, then at the house, and finally at the road where my son would one day return. "I spent my whole life building walls of glass and steel," I told him. "I thought I was building a kingdom, but I was just building a cage. This tree? It doesn't have a doomsday clause. It doesn't have a board of directors. It just has us. And as long as we take care of it, it'll be here long after the money is gone. I looked at the horizon. I was 71 years old. I had lost my wife. I had nearly lost my son. And I had destroyed an empire. I had lived in a basement and I had ruled from a penthouse. But as I sat there in the dirt with my grandson, I realized that I had finally found the one thing I had been searching for during all those late nights on the docks. I had found peace. The Doomsday Clause had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had destroyed everything that was rotten, leaving behind only what was strong enough to survive the fire. It had cost me a fortune, but it had bought me a future. I didn't know it yet, I whispered, closing my eyes as the first stars began to twinkle over Boston. But the Namui Bond wasn't a lesson for Sammy. It was a lesson for me, and it only took me a lifetime to learn it. I leaned my head back against the porch steps and listened to the wind in the leaves. The king was dead, but for the first time in my life, the man was finally alive.